What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. My guest today, he's an associate professor of international studies at the University of Washington, where Bruce Lee studied. He's also a co-host of the American Prestige podcast, which is a must listen. And he's probably the author of everything you've ever read about left foreign policy that wasn't written by like me or Aziz Rana. You might have seen him recently on a little show called Real Time with Bill Maher. Love to see it. And he has a fantastic critical essay out in The Nation magazine called A Bad Breakup, The Discontent of Francis Fukuyama. My guest is the human lightning rod, Danny Bessner. Welcome to the show, brother. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Van. Appreciate it.
So we're trying to key off of your essay in The Nation, grappling with like Fukuyamian liberalism. And I guess like we don't want to spend a ton of time on his like personal background, but there's some stuff there that's salient. What do you think people should know going into critiques of Fukuyama liberalism?
Well, it's interesting because I think there's actually a lot more work to be done than I did in the piece. I really just focused on his professional career. He began, PhD in government from Harvard on the Middle East, and then he became an intern at the Rand Corporation. I think while he was still finishing up his dissertation throughout the 1980s, he moved between, if I recall correctly, mostly Rand and the State Department. He did various government posts, wound up eventually at the policy planning staff. And he was actually at the policy planning staff, I believe, when he wrote The End of History in 1989. That essay appeared in the National Interest, was a huge hit. He became a celebrity intellectual over the course of the 90s and has kind of moved between a series of institutions, writing for a bunch of different places, and he is presently at Stanford. But I think there's a couple, just for anyone who wants to maybe do more work on him, I think there's a religious background there, if I recall correctly, a type of Protestantism that might be influential. And also he grew up in California, and there's certainly a California element to his thinking, which I didn't really touch on, but I think are probably robust places to look for people who are going to do more work on Fukuyama. So that's the long and the short of it.
That was extremely efficient. So he was part of, this was like in the subtext of what you were saying, but he was part of like a neoconservative social network. And then after the Iraq War, he disavowed them. But I always thought of neoconservatism as like a more overtly imperial strand of liberal internationalism. Like they're really owning it more. What do you think about neoconservatism, like as a term? Does it fit Fukuyama? Is there anything to make of the fact that like he disavows them?
I think neoconservatism is a form of updated Cold War liberalism, a kind of tragic view of politics mixed with a faith in American empire. The big difference between Cold War liberalism and neoconservatism is that the Cold War liberals were, I think, more explicit about wanting things like full employment, racial progress through military Keynesianism, and the neocons either don't talk about that or are much more pessimistic about it. But they're the question almost you're asking is, how different is neoconservatism really from liberal internationalism? I would say not that much. They're both forms of primacist thinking. It's just how the United States goes about its primacy and hegemony, or what liberal internationalists would call leadership, and some neocons might also use that term. So to me, that's the kind of basic point of it. It doesn't really matter if Fukuyama doesn't associate with the neoconservative movements in sort of the structural in terms of the structure, because he just asserts U.S. primacy. And so, like, how different is that whether you go through the UN or not? Maybe it's different in marginal cases, but structurally not that much.
Yeah, that makes sense. I always wonder how much to like when liberals paint neoconservatives as like this god awful alien thing, there's a kind of maneuver that's happening there where it's like obscuring how similar these things are, or that it's one branch of the family.
Yeah, I
Um,
think it absolutely is. There's really not that much of a difference. And like basically everyone who makes a career in foreign policy, like 95% of people would fall into a primacist camp in the United States, I would say. So there's really not that much difference between all of these people talking about the same things, which is one reason foreign policy discussion is so boring. And that it's like not that actually intellectually stimulating for the most part because it's kind of talking about the margins.
yeah, no, that's right. I mean, that's one of the things that was alienating, aside from like finding substantive problems with the sort of foreign policy apparatus that I was supporting. It was really like there's not much going on here. Like everybody's just hustling to find a new angle on how we best support the status quo. And it's like that's never going to be exciting unless you're doing wars, you know. So that's problematic.
Oh, I completely agree.
What so he got famous off this The End of History and The Last Man, like you said. This is like the it's bizarre almost how famous this book is. What for just people like everybody hasn't read it, and some people probably read it, but like 30 years ago. What was his argument there? What were the moves that he was making there?
The essential argument was that there has been a convergence in international politics toward a form of liberal democratic capitalism. That even in this so-called socialist world, it seemed to Fukuyama at the time that the liberal precepts were being embraced, particularly in terms of economic organization. There was a liberalization of the economies happening in the Soviet Union and various other third world, or at the time called third world, or are now called the global South nations. Um, it was mostly about economics, and the notion was that economic liberalization would eventually lead to a form of political liberalization over time, which was a classic argument of modernization theory. But that was the basic idea, that history in the Hegelian sense of a struggle between ideas and ideologies had ended with the triumph of liberalism, really liberal democratic capitalism, that form of liberalism. And so it was on one hand triumphant, and so that's the triumphant part, and on the other hand, it was melancholic, because Fukuyama, like many Cold War liberals, going back to the 40s and the 50s, and even before formal Cold War liberalism in the 30s, there's also this kind of lamentation element to it, because liberalism to these people appeared a bit bloodless. It's not a grand project; it's tinkering, it's reformist, and so there was a melancholy about some age of romantic heroism had come to an end with the slow liberalization of the Soviet Union. Remember, this is before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, so he's writing before the Soviet Union was over, but kind of the end of the Cold War. So that's basically the long and the short of it. And Fukuyama himself, over the course of the 90s, from what I'm aware of, actually moved away from that functional modernization theory argument rather, that economic modernization would lead to political liberalization, though that is evident in the End of History essay itself.
I mean, this thing was so zeitgeisty. How did conservative intellectuals respond to it at the time or since, I guess?
Most conservative intellectuals disagree with it. They basically, there was a forum, I believe, in the National Interest written that happened soon after the essay came out, and most basically disagreed. It was more so kind of the mainstream status quo that accepted it, both in Washington D.C. and the public, and less so the conservative eggheads.
You mentioned how a lot of people challenged Fukuyama's sort of argument on the grounds that like liberalism is under siege in so many obvious ways. Like it can't tame inequality, it can't tame the excesses of capitalism. And you have this quote that I took as the argument of the essay. You say, "quote Though Fukuyama is willing to acknowledge many of liberalism's limitations, he cannot envision a world beyond it. The tragedy of our times is that he doesn't really need to, because the argument he proffered in The End of History has proved correct." So this is obviously this resonated with me, but like, what do you mean?
Basically, that there haven't been ideological challenges to liberalism in decades. Not there hasn't been a competing universalistic theory to challenge liberal precepts, and it doesn't seem like any is going to arise. It might just be that kind of the mid 19th century to the late 20th century was a particularly ideological age where people were willing to fight and die over ideas, and that this just might not be a human norm in general. You even see it in Russia and China. They're certainly not liberal politically, but they are capitalist, and in some element liberal capitalist, different than the United States, of course, but they do, I think, to a large degree, both embrace forms of market economics, some more directed by the state, some less directed by the state, but basically within a broad capitalist framework. So that's effectively what I meant, that we're kind of in a post-ideological age where power and economic power matters more than ideological power, which is, very much not the argument that people made throughout the Cold War. And even if you think of someone like Joe Nye making an argument about soft power, really centers ideology in a way that I just don't think is accurate. I don't think like culture really matters that much today. Ideology doesn't really matter that much. I actually kind of think ideology didn't really matter that much after the 1960s, that it was much less a driver of politics on both sides of the Iron Curtain, even though it was more than it was today. But that was effectively what I was trying to get across with that statement there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned Cold War liberalism and how it's I forgot how you characterized it, but it was like at least full employment and military Keynesianism, but like grafted onto a nationalist project that sought primacy. What did you say? I can't remember.
Yeah. I mean, like there were progressive elements to Cold War liberalism, particularly in terms of race and in terms of employment and class. Like it was a real goal of the Cold War liberals to reach full employment. It was a real goal for many of them to support the civil rights movement, both out of personal conviction, also out of, as many people like Brenda Gale Plummer and Mary Dudziak have argued, as a way to present the United States as a genuinely democratic nation. And that just kind of like totally disappeared from the neoconservative worldview over the course of the 60s and 70s in response to the new left, effectively.
Mhm.
So I think that is a big difference between Cold War liberalism and the type of national security liberalism that is, proffered today. Even though you do see elements of it in things like the woke CIA, memes that, our torturers should look more like America type arguments. But
Yeah,
I don't think it is
multiracial
as
ruling
core.
class. Yeah.
Yeah, the typical liberal response to these things, that diversity and representation, but the system basically remains the same, which is
Yeah.
like you see it across spheres. And foreign policy, it's just, it always strikes such a discordant chord because America has just done so many bad things abroad that there's like a whiff of evil around it. So I think that's why people glean to things like the woke CIA, but this is very clear in other elements of the liberal structure. The generation of Cold War liberals in the 50s and 60s really supported the non-communist left. To them, it seemed like a lot of the non-communist and communist socialist left was just beyond the pale, and so that, I think, engenders their shift more than students yelling at Berkeley. Students who, like, 5 years later, would totally buy into the system for the most part anyway.
Yeah. Why were people like Fukuyama sad boys about the coming of unipolarity? Like what?
I think, like, I mean, they had organized their life around the Soviet Union, and they had spent years studying it. They felt a connection to it. I think that movie Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, based on the Le Carre novel,
Mhm.
gets it as well when they all sing the Soviet anthem at the Christmas party. Right, there was like an affection for the Soviet Union because it was like kind of a worthy enemy, and so it was this notion of the losing of a grand project. That liberalism, like technocratic liberalism of tinkering around the edges, isn't really an exciting way to live your life. And I think that has a lot to do with it. They were unmoored. And you see, various ways to try to get that old magic back in the 90s, humanitarian intervention, responsibility to
Mhm.
protect. And you have terrorism after 9/11. Now you have China, but none of it hits quite like the Soviet Union because it seemed like you were really fighting for, the future of world history. And I don't think many people believe that nowadays.
Yeah, you had a great line where you said something like the Soviet Union was the Joker to Fukuyama's Batman. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah.
Yeah, what does Batman do once the guy's locked up?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
So I had a Jeannie Moorfield on here a while back, and she said something about, or no, I said something about how the nature of liberalism made it always be at the extremes of either triumphalism or crisis. And then she like acknowledged that, and then she said that even in moments of triumphalism, the crisis tendency was like always there.
Well, I
What do
mean,
you
that's
think about that?
definitional of liberalism. If you think about like the first modern liberal, I don't really buy that liberalism goes back to Locke or those people. Those are proto-liberals, but the first real instantiation is Benjamin Constant and Madame de Stael in response to the French Revolution. And so their whole point was to navigate a path between monarchism and revolutionary bourgeois democracy, I guess, on the other hand. And so it necessarily views itself as moderating. And so if you're viewing yourself as moderating, you have to define yourself against something else, and that tends toward crisis thinking. And I think that's endemic to liberalism from the beginning.
What the Immanuel Kant comes up in some of Fukuyama's work though. Like, what does he see in him?
I think he basically buys into the perpetual peace notion, the Kantian argument that over time, liberal democracies are more likely to deal with each other and achieve some form of global peace. I think that's basically it. Sort of proto-democratic peace theory.
Hmm. Well, so you might as well go around imposing regime change. Um,
Exactly.
um, so, okay, so in Fukuyama's latest book, which you like, might have been the trigger for that essay that you wrote. It was the essay was like really all encompassing, but like I guess the timing made it such that like you were talking about his latest book, Liberalism and Its Discontents.
Yeah, it
Um,
was primarily an intellectual history, less of a review, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That was, yeah. I mean, like, also, you can't really make sense or critique the Liberalism and Its Discontents book if you don't reference End of History. I mean, like,
Yeah,
um,
they're
but
very critical, yeah.
yeah, like, there's some high-minded rhetoric in the stuff that he's saying about classical liberalism, which he kind of uses to critique neoliberalism, like attacking neoliberalism from the right almost. And the high-minded stuff is about like individual liberty. He says the phrase a lot, like, what is it? Individuals are like morally equal, but then he like but he's a ruling class theologian basically. Like I mean, he works at Stanford. Like, he exists to support a plutocracy in a lot of ways. Like, he rationalizes the preservation of plutocracy even though he accepts that people are like individually morally equal. And classical liberalism is like his tool for doing this. So like, what do you what do you think about that? But what is classical liberalism anyway?
Yeah, I mean, unclear. I think it basically refers to liberalism is itself an interesting ideology because it is, as Gary Gersel famously said, it's very protean, and I think it's useful
Mm,
to view it as basically responding to a series of problem situations organized around an individualist ethos. So I think that's basically what he's trying to do there is that you have the individualist ethos of people are, humanistically, morally equal, but the individualist ethos also informs things like entrepreneurialism and political liberalism and justification for inequality because individuals, while morally equal, might not be in their talents. The desserts
yeah.
they receive, to use a philosophical term, are not equal because people are individually different, morally equal but individually different. And I think that's kind of what he means by classical liberalism, this sort of individualist ethos.
Yeah. It seems probably, I mean, I don't preaching to the choir, I suppose, but if your theory of individual liberty is like requires limited government, then you're kind of justifying the power of the powerful. Like, you're
Yeah, it's
giving
all
up on
bullshit.
inequality. Yeah.
Liberalism, it's I mean, it's all bullshit. Liberalism is just an ideology of the powerful, like flat out.
Well, there we have it.
Yeah. I mean, it's not exactly a surprise. Again, this is why like so much of the like foreign policy discourse is just so boring because it's like justifications for the ruling elite in various ways. Uh, in the 50s or 60s, that might have felt more exciting because there was this grand ideological project, but to me, it just seems tired and frankly just boring.
Yeah, there's something to that. You said something like that on Bill Maher, and he was like, I don't know, he he gave some weird response where like he didn't buy it or something, but then it came back and it actually made sense. Like I don't know. It's been on my mind ever since I saw you on that show. Um, in 2018, Fukuyama published a book called Identity,
Mhm.
and I skimmed it because like I did a job talk at Stanford. I knew I was going to meet him. He came to the talk, and the book was kind of shit from what I remember. Like it embraced a lot of like armchair critiques that come from the left about like alienation under globalization.
I never actually read his work on identity. I really should, but so I can't comment on it. But from what I in the Liberalism and its Discontents book, it's he had the classic criticism of ID politics you hear all the time. It's again not especially illuminating. It's divisive. It doesn't allow us to achieve some sort of national wholeness. It separates rather than brings together, which is the classical left liberal criticism of ID politics. He makes gestures towards a left wing critique, which is that like we have to focus on class, but ultimately he affirms that should be accomplished through a form of reformist liberalism, which I just think like has empirically been shown to not really be possible. Or it tends towards oligarchy over not that long of a time period. So it's
Yeah.
like if you're not going to take the history of actually existing liberalism into account, there's only so many criticisms that one can make.
I heard him say on a podcast that in prep for this that liberalism is only guilty by association of the crimes in its name. And like
You say about so is communism. So I mean, you can say it about anything.
yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
like literally that's a move that you could do in any context.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so he in the reason I brought the book up, the identity thing, the argument I didn't take very seriously, but it kind of set up liberalism and its discontents in the sense that like he thought that a reenactment of the Cold War would be a kind of salve for extreme right-wing identity politics, and
Right,
it just
right.
might require having to shut down progressive politics. Um, do you think there's something? Well, I feel like I'm this softball questioning you here. Do you think that trying to do a new Cold War will fix this like alienation problem in society?
No, and also obviously not because the US and Soviet Union barely traded. Like the structuring relationship of the US and China is so different that whatever form or a rivalry takes would
Yeah.
just be so different. And I mean, like it again doesn't take account of what's actually happening. Like, does he think there'll be another National Defense and Education Act to fund area studies, like there was in the Cold War? Does he think there'd be a massive expansion of the American university for this idea that we needed to, create a cultural elite like there was during a Cold War? I don't think so. So whatever form a so-called new Cold War would take, which I'm skeptical of happening. I think what both sides want is to, gin up anger at the other so
Mhm.
that they could reaffirm their political legitimacy without actually decoupling economically, which would be very different than the first Cold War. But should it happen, it would look very different than whatever the US Soviet rivalry looked like. I just don't, does he even really believe that? I don't know. It's such a silly thing to argue. He's too smart for that.
Yeah, well, maybe he doesn't think we are. Um, yeah, I mean, so like one of the problems I have many problems with Cold War liberalism, but like one of the problems with trying to do it again is that like these projects like National Defense Education Act and all this stuff, like that for that the Democratic Party basically would end up treating those things as the maximal horizon of possibility. Like the most we can ever aspire to is what happened, the good stuff that we got out of the Cold War. And like that that's worse than passive revolution. That's like there's not real progress there. And we're working from such a like austeritized kind of shitty baseline that like we end up in a place that is probably like worse than what we got with neoliberalism. Like neoliberalism, it didn't like emerge accidentally. Like it followed through a process where like we were doing a New Deal order and like we were getting some things. Those some things that we got were not the horizon of possibility in the Cold War, but they would become the horizon of possibility now. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think our horizons are pretty limited in general, and I think like liberalism clearly isn't answering the call of the times, but for whatever reason, and I'm sure there are many, there have been no ideological challengers to it.
Yes, which was key to your essay. You make some good points in the essay about like the left and the right. Fukuyama kind of flattens the differences or does this both sidesy thing where it's like the left and the right are equally crazy, just in different flavors. Um, what is the differences that you see you talk about in that essay between left and right?
I mean, I ultimately think that liberalism is much more of a threat to the type of world that one would try to build than the right wing. I think the right wing has outside power in this country due to the structure of American politics, both in terms of things like Congress and the Electoral College,
Mhm.
and the fact that there's clearly an age division split between right and left, and so a lot of the mainstream media organizations kind of tend toward a right wing philosophy or approach, particularly Fox News and OAN or whatever the other ones are called.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, I think that there's a kind of a rump, revanchist, xenophobic, and racist right wing that supported Donald Trump, and that will probably continue to exist in American politics and has been in American politics from the beginning. But I think that the people who will mostly continue to rule, not only in terms of who's elected to things like the presidency or Congress, but also kind of the so-called deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, basically liberal, um, except in the judiciary because the Democrats have been so bad about preventing things like the election of conservative judges. So we have a right wing judiciary, which is very important. We have kind of a liberal deep state, and then we have these sorts of various constellations of far right movements percolating that are actually not that many people, but are more powerful given the structure of the country. So I think that's the situation that we're in, and that has basically allowed elite liberals to just re-embrace and reaffirm their own quote unquote moderation in light of a perceived right wing threat.
Yeah, I mean, what's tragicomic here too, and you mentioned this in the essay, is that the left in America, as such, is not the left of the 1930s or the 1950s, even or the 1960s, even. It's fucking. I mean, it's anti-revolutionary for sure. It's made its peace with democracy, right? Like the farthest that you go left in any kind of like public discourse is democratic socialism. So it's like marrying socialism with a framework of republicanism or something, or like with the Constitution. If that's as far as you go, then like the left cannot possibly be the boogeyman that you like need
No,
it
it's
to
just he's
be.
annoyed with people he meets in like these hyper elite spheres at the university. It's like very classic. Like
He's
he's
upset about
annoyed at some
DEI.
people. Yeah, he's around in wherever he lives, Palo Alto.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. It's unserious.
Um,
It just is.
I love it. Our mutual friend Mike Brennis, who was supposed to be initially on this episode with us, he wrote last year that like the Biden administration was the perfect avatar of Fukuyama liberalism. What do you think of that?
What did Mike mean by that? And then I can answer it if you could just expel out a bit what he meant.
Oh, that like the sort of anti woke, quote unquote,
Oh yeah.
vital center liberalism is basically but the Biden administration incarnate, and that's what Fukuyama like advocate. That seems to be his
Yeah,
politics.
yeah,
Like,
he's like, from my sense, again, I haven't read the book on identity, but he seems to be like anti-woke,
yeah,
anti-ID Paul, seems to frame seems to frame politics in that way, and that somehow being equivalent to like kind of a radical right wing, which to me just doesn't seem accurate.
yeah,
But again, like in the spheres in which he operates, it's certainly more quote unquote woke liberalism than radical right. So that's um I think where he goes wrong.
You think I haven't heard him say anything about the Biden administration, but you think Fukuyama probably is like big fan of the Biden, the direction things are going?
I would say broadly speaking.
Um, Sorry, I'm drinking a lot of coffee. I
No
wanted to ask
worries.
you a quick question about the Rand Corporation because you've done like a shitload of research in this area, like you've investigated them quite a bit, but also like Rand fits into the background of Fukuyama. Um, they're there's they're clearly like the intellectual arm of the military-industrial complex. Like it's explicit. They're clearly militarists wielding social science tools, but they've also incubated some like dissident talent. I don't know that Fukuyama would count as that, but like Daniel Ellsberg, they have
Sure,
like some
that's
restrainers and stuff.
bound to happen.
Yeah, I mean, what do you
Like,
make of Rand? How do you think about
I mean,
them?
they're the intellectual arm of the U.S. national security state. The first, and there's a bunch more think tanks now, but they're still an important one. I mean, this is the world of think tanks.
Mhm.
If you're in a think tank for the most part, unless you're at Quincy or Defense Priorities or Cato, you're probably going to support American military hegemony. And, is there that much of a difference between the Center for American Progress and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, even though they're like ideologically,
Nope.
supposedly dissimilar? It's the same shit. So, like Rand is more sophisticated. I mean, I think the stuff coming out of Rand is generally more sophisticated than the other stuff. It's higher level.
Real
Um,
analysis, yeah.
yeah, it's actually like kind of real. But for the most part, the ideological, if you're at Rand, you kind of believe the US should run the world in some fashion. So not 100% true. But Rand is one of the better ones. Actually, there's some like real garbage coming out of the think tank space, like really, really boring status quo stuff. And I wonder how much of that is just like the feature of the American gerontocracy is that like a lot of people who work here are older and the people they hire to work for them are younger. Um, or like the younger people that hire to work for them like agree with them. Like it always seems to me like Barry Weiss is a 60-year-old's idea of what a millennial should be. So I feel like you get that kind of like vibe in think tank world and in elite worlds as well. Very status quo. Same thing in academia. So I don't know, maybe things will change like as things are wont to do once the boomers finally die, but TBD.
Yeah, in the foreign policy, the boomers have such a lock on opportunities, and there are these like social net. I mean, this used to be my world. The opportunities that are available in foreign policy for young people with $100,000 of student debt, needing a job, swearing by patriotism. They just want to serve, quote unquote, but actually they're like looking for any ladder to climb that they can find. And like the only way to get ahead, aside from like slotting into a civil service thing through usajobs.gov or whatever, is to find a patron, like a feudal lord or whatever. And the feudal lords are all boomers, and they're the ones with the Rolodexes that like have different opportunities and place you in different places. But you can't intellectually clash swords with your feudal lord. And so like you get people like Kurt Campbell who are they come from a fucking totally different era, and they're basically Republicans, but they're the kingmakers of the Democratic Party. So they're the horizon of possibility for foreign policy, and then they're the ones who are setting the boundaries of like what the young people can really think. So it's like if you're like an iconoclastic thinker or an independent thinker in some way, or if you have like socialist convictions in some way, fucking good luck. Good luck finding a feudal lord who's going to take you on, you know?
Yeah, you could only do it in academia, and you could really only do it
Yeah.
if you have tenure. I didn't really start writing until I had tenure, or until my book was out. I started writing when my book was out, but I was pretty sure that I was going to get tenure. So
Mm.
yeah, it's basically impossible. It's just going to be an oligarchy of people who effectively believe the same things. Which is why it's so boring. Like I really do find foreign policy discussions in this country for the most part very boring. Like just like Foreign Affairs is just a boring magazine for the most part. Um, it's not that intellectually stimulating.
That should be
So
a piece. You should write that up. Like I
yeah, but no one will pay me, right? This is a
that's
problem.
not foreign affairs. Um, do you
Foreign
think
Affairs barely pays. I mean,
yeah, it's like
whatever. Yeah,
$100 or something.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's nothing. It's a joke. You can only be rich to do it.
that's the idea.
Yeah.
So for I had one thought about Rand that like there's a progressivism in what Rand is doing, but it's like it's like the problematic side of progressivism because
Yeah, I
it's
actually
like
wrote an essay about this called The Progressive Origins of Project Rand. I mean, it's related to just sort of the progressive era idea of expertise and elite rule and making war more humane. I mean, the national security state is not conservative, it's liberal in its orientation and function. It really does believe that it's using expertise and forms of knowledge, social, scientific, and other, to
Mhm.
basically make war, which is viewed as endemic, more humane. So yeah, no, I think that's completely right. And Rand is probably, again, the best instantiation of that because it's like the highest level of it. It's smart. They do good analysis. They do serious analysis, but it's still ideologically geared in a particular way for the most part. Not 100%, but for the most part.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I really think that I don't say this pejoratively, but like Rand is what happens when you have a sort of progressive politics, but without any kind of commitment to anti-militarism. Like if you refuse to embrace anti-militarism, even in principle, but you insist on being progressive, the result, the best case result is that you like come out with a Rand. And so like that seems to jive with what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Um, I had like one parting question,
Sure.
speculative. So, like, our politics in the US does not favor socialism, obviously. Socialism has no real grasp on power, except at like the margins of Justice Democrats or something. What stops socialism from being the end of history intellectually? Like posing communism as the alternative to liberalism, it obscures how you could have a synthesis, going back to Hegel, that looks like highly participatory democracy or democratic socialism. Like, wouldn't that be like a higher stage of human development than like grind set alienation, individual liberalism? Like,
Yeah, I mean, well, Marx said that like either the proletariat would become conscious in and of itself, seize the means of production, and transcend capitalism in order to use the technologies created by capitalism for the human good. I think we might be living in a world. The phrase that I use is that Skynet has become self-aware. Like we work for the algorithm, and the algorithm doesn't work for us. And Marx also said if we didn't, if the humanity through the proletariat didn't do that, then there would be the mutual ruin of the contending classes, which he said had described earlier periods of human history. And I think it's very likely that we live in that world. I mean, just think of like all the ideological work done by people, very smart people, in favor of like horrible neoliberal capitalism. It just seems like there's very little hope to transcend it. Like the proletariat didn't do what Marx hoped it would do. And so here we are.
yeah. Well, man, that was a great way to end it. Danny Bessner, thanks for coming on the show, dude. This is
Thanks
awesome.
for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks.